Welcome to the Good Medicine Podcast, where science, health policy, and the future of medicine meet real conversation. I'm your host, Dr. David Beers. Today, we're going to be diving into the controversy swirling around the two of the most powerful health agencies in the world, the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration of the United States. There's been a lot in the news, if you've been paying attention, about controversy happening with growing tension over calls for reform and budget cuts and even structural overhauls of these agencies. The critics argue that they've become too bloated and inefficient and overly bureaucratic, and the supporters warn that gutting them could set American biomedical leadership back decades. So what's going on and what's at stake? We're going to have a short conversation today to talk about what's happening with these agencies and why there's a controversy. So to begin with, I think the easiest place to start is just how big are the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the FDA today? These are very large government agencies. The NIH budget last year was $47 billion, and that was up from $30 billion in 2015. So if you think about that in terms of growth, that's more than 50% increase in less than a decade. So that obviously throws up some red flags of why are we spending so much more money in this area and what does the NIH do for us? And then we look at the FDA, and also a very large organization, $6.7 billion, up from about $4.5 billion in 2017. So about similar increase. The FDA is a little different because their budget is largely offset by what are called user fees. And user fees are paid by companies that submit applications to get drugs reviewed and approved by the FDA. And so about half of the NIH budget is actually paid for by user fees. So if you look at that $6.7 billion budget, about half of that is actually made up by user fees. Then you start looking at the number of employees, and this is where it gets quite large. So the NIH has over 20,000 employees, and the FDA is right around 19,000 employees. And once again, these are big increases in the last 10 years back from where they started. So the NIH and the FDA have been around for many years. The NIH, if we look back just 15 years ago, the NIH had 27 institutes. So when it's organized as the National Institutes of Health, and so within the institutes, there are actually 27 institutes and centers at the NIH. And if we look back 15 years ago, there were 27 institutes and centers. But the question is, do we need all of those? When you look at how things have changed and how diseases are changing in our demographics in our society, are these 27 still the best 27? Is 27 the right number? As you can imagine, in today's world, there's a lot of debate on, do we need 27 agencies? And is there a lot of redundancy? And there is, obviously. So every agency operates semi-independently. They do have a core unit that houses some core functions, but each agency each institute at the NIH actually operates fairly independently. And so the big question is there too much waste and inefficiency across 27 different institutes and centers? Do we really need that many? The FDA is a little less complicated, but still, there are 9 centers at the FDA and 13 headquarter offices. And what I think people are concerned about the FDA is just the significant expanded oversight of the agency, that there seems to be a lot of changes that have led to bureaucratic overreach by a lot of folks. So when we think about the case for shrinking and cutting costs, that's really where the crux of the matter is that the people on the political side really pushing for pushing for oversight, additional oversight, is that these agencies has overreached their original intent, both for overseeing research and funding and sponsoring research, as well as from the FDA side, what they actually regulate. The FDA, if you think about it, regulates 20% of consumer spending in the United States is regulated by the FDA. So that's all food and all drugs. And that's 20% of every dollar spent, 20 cents is spent on food or drugs. So that's a big chunk. If you think about any regulatory agency, it's probably the largest oversight from a regulatory standpoint. One of the big questions is as these agencies have grown in scope and grown in numbers in terms of people and facilities, there tends to become cost of inefficiencies. And I think, if you're being pragmatic and looking at it, there's always ways to save money. If you look at it and say, do we really need all of these programs? And I think there's always the argument of, I think it's healthy to look at any organization and say, is this operating the best that it possibly can? So those are some of the questions that are being asked on the cost cutting side, and the questions that people are asking about. Are these agencies really doing what we wanted them to do? Are they really doing what's best for our country and for our society? And they really promoting health, which at the end of the day is why they're there. So the Food and Drug Administration is there to make sure that we have a healthy food supply and that we have drugs that are both safe and effective for treating diseases. And then the NIH is there to oversee and to provide research support for the research that goes on at a national level and set priorities to say, here's what needs to happen, what's important for our health and wellness, and here's the types of things that we're going to fund. And so there's always the question of, as you let an organization grow, there tends to be mission creep that happens. And so this mission creep is that they start to take on missions that originally were not intended. And I think if you're just being pragmatic and looking at this in an objective way, I think it's hard to argue that there isn't mission creep happening at both the FDA and the NIH. But does that mean that we throw the whole agency away? I think once again, being pragmatic and objective, looking at it is these agencies provide tremendous amount of good. And I think the people that work at them are motivated to help promote the health and wellness of the United States. And so I think there's this polarization that tends to happen. They look at these government agencies and say, hey, everything they're doing is bad, or the other side defends everything they're doing is good. And really, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. One thing that I can say from the standpoint of being a drug developer is that the regulatory environment in the United States is not streamlined in a way that leads to the fastest decisions and also the most cost-effective decisions that are being made for how we develop drugs. And I think we've talked about it previously, that it is a delicate balance, because if you swing too far one way or the other, you can be criticized for taking too much risk in promoting things that aren't safe, or that you're not, if you go too far the other direction, that you're not allowing access to potentially life-saving or life-changing new therapies that could be, really having an impact on people's lives. So it's a really difficult situation, and there's not any easy answers. But looking objectively, you can understand where both sides are coming from. I think one of the things that's most disturbing is happening is there is an erosion happening with the trust of science and the scientific process and what we can and can't conclude from scientific studies. I think that there's, once again, I think we've become too polarized as a country that one side says you have to 100% trust what science says, and without really defining what that really even means and what they're trying to say when they say trust the science, what the scope of that is. And the other side really sowing a lot of distrust for science. And one of the things that I think has happened is that we've gotten too much politics into science. So, for example, BioHive is a nonprofit building the future of healthcare innovation right here in Utah. As one of the nation's fastest-growing life science industries, they bring together scientists, entrepreneurs, students, and companies to create breakthroughs that save lives and strengthen our economy. Whether you're in a lab or at a startup, BioHive is here to build, brand, and bring together a thriving life science community, and there's a place for you.
Learn more, get involved, and see their latest happenings at biohive.com.
When Congress decides to set aside money to fund a certain area that they want studies done on, for example, one that's been in the news a lot is global warming. So global warming kind of falls directly outside of the FDA or the NIH, although global warming certainly plays a role in people's health and wellness. And there's a lot of, in production of food and the types of, crops actually respond differently to different heat. And so if we grow crops at a certain temperature and that temperature increases, the actual proteins and the genetic programs that are activated in those plants actually change. And so there are consequences to our health, either indirectly or directly, by changes in climate. And so it certainly does play a role at the NIH and the FDA. But let's just use this as an example. So, for example, if the Congress passes a bill and appropriates money to say, we want to study the negative consequences of global warming. So that sounds fine, but if you do not provide the same amount of money for the other side to say, well, what are the potential positive outcomes from global warming? You're by default, you're biasing the outcome of those studies because you're only going to fund studies that suggest that there are negative outcomes from global warming. And so that leads to a narrowed scientific consensus. And I think that that's what's being pushed, is saying, hey, we've done this too much. And we've done this with lots of different areas, with gender, with mental health, a lot of issues that have become highly politicized. We've set aside money to study one thing, and we potentially have biased and narrowed the scientific outcomes because we're funding programs that if you receive a grant under. So, for example, the way this works, if you tell the NIH, we want to study the negative outcomes of global warming on people's health, you're going to get grant applications. So you set aside that money and say, this is what we want to fund. And there's what's called a request for proposals that goes out to say, we want proposals that study the negative outcomes of global warming on people's health. So all the applications you're going to receive are going to be focused on studying negative outcomes. And so, then you can, you get the data from those, you get the publications that come out from that research, and you would assume that there's only negative outcomes because that's all that gets published. So there's no money to study positive outcomes. And I'm not saying there are positive outcomes. I'm just saying this is what the arguments are. But once again, being objective, there can't be just negative outcomes. There has to be something that you can focus on. And I think what we're trying to weigh is, where are the positive and negatives, and what are those things, and how do they balance? And I think that's the pragmatic and objective way to look at things, and not be completely focused on one side or the other to say this is 100% universally bad or 100% universally good. Once again, I think the truth usually lies somewhere in the middle. It's usually not 100% on one side or the other. So I'm just using that as an example of what the argument is for the politicization of science. And it can happen on the other side as well. You could focus and say, I want to only study the negative outcomes of gender reassignment surgery. And you're going to get a bunch of publications that say gender reassignment surgery is the worst thing in the world. And so then the people that hold that political belief are going to go out and say, look at this, science says that gender reassignment surgery is terrible. So those are the things that people get worried about, is when we interject political views and political hot button items into science, it actually sows distrust for the outcomes that people come up with. To be honest, I think that when we try to carve out and narrow research and try to bias the potential outcomes, or at least enrich for proposals for a certain area of study, we actually there are unintended consequences for that I think we're dealing with today. And I think that, once again, trying to be objective, we can't say that hasn't happened. It clearly has happened. And so it gives ammunition to people that oppose these types of measures, and it is why there is a groundswell of support for trying to gut some of these agencies. So now let's talk about the case from the other side. Let's talk about the case against shrinking the NIH and the FDA. So I would say that it is objectively that the United States has been the global leader in science, and especially in life sciences, which are the study of sciences associated with our health and wellness that the NIH and the FDA oversee and have oversight for, that we are clearly the leaders in the world. We, by far, the most research is conducted and published, and the most breakthroughs have happened, and most of the therapies that we've discovered have come from the United States. And so there's a strong case to say, don't mess this up. This is a place where we have clear leadership and clear advantage over other places in the world. And I think because this is such a wide sweeping area, I don't think there's a person on the planet that doesn't want to be healthy. When you ask people, what's most important in your life, health and their family are probably the two most common answers that people say is, I'm worried about my health and I'm worried about my family. And those are things that people universally around the world are worried about. And the United States plays a major role in in supporting research that leads to health and wellness. So conceding or ceding that role to somebody else in the world, I think, has potentially dramatic and terrible consequences for us. And so you can certainly make the case that we shouldn't mess around with an area that we have clear leadership and clear competitive advantage in this whole arena. We have a public health and safety infrastructure that I think is a model to the rest of the world. I think most regulatory agencies around the country look at our public health and our safety infrastructure as a model to build off of or to shape in their countries. And it's been one of those areas that has taken a lot of years for us to build up, and to just gut it and destroy all of that in a matter of days and months. I think there's a lot of cause for concern and concern about, let's be careful about how we try to enact reforms and regulations that people are trying to push. Obviously, complexity requires oversight, and I think the complexity of the health and wellness and the drug and food industry has become tremendously greater. It's far more complex than it used to be. We have the ability to do things that even 20 years ago seemed like science fiction. Areas of stem cell research and regenerative medicine and gene editing, and the list goes on, and the implications of what that means to humans. And we can do a lot of those same things in plants, and what that means to our food. Genetically modified food is widely used and grown and accepted, and the question is, should we just let people have at it and do whatever they want and go and create new changes in the genetics of the food, both animals and plants that we eat? I think that all of us, once again, taking a step back and trying to be objective, I would say that it's actually a good thing to have some oversight of that we don't want to just let things be chaotic and I know there's a lot of people out there that say, hey, the free market is the best the best way to get to handle complexity and to handle oversight. And I think that there's certainly arguments that that's actually not the case with certain things. And in this area of people's health and wellness, I think this is one of the areas we have to be very careful. What if you could get rewarded just for being healthier? Meet Galvin, the company using the latest blockchain technology to reward you for taking care of yourself. They help with your mind, body, and soul like a personalized health assistant to track your progress and help you feel better. Galvin's G Plus app rewards you for exercise and assesses your mental health in under a minute using AI and over 2,500 voice biomarkers. If you're feeling off, G Plus gives you personalized power-ups, science-backed techniques to help you feel better fast. And here's the best part. When you prioritize your wellness, you earn crypto. Ready to level up your health? Use promo code GOODMED20 at checkout for 20% off. Download G Plus today at the Apple app or Google Play Store and start your wellness journey with Galvin. We just came out of a global pandemic that's just a few years ago. We're still learning lessons from that. And the question is, how do we implement those lessons? Do we promote reform and change, or do we just destroy the infrastructure that we have because we don't like how things have happened? I don't think there's a single person that I know that looks at the way we handled the pandemic and said, oh, that was perfect. We didn't do anything wrong. I think all of us can accept that the way we handled the pandemic and the lessons that we need to learn need to be solidified in reforms. We need to look at it and say, what did we do right and what did we do wrong? Because the likelihood of us facing another one of these global pandemics is clearly not zero, right? There's not a 0% chance. In fact, it's probably pretty high that the probability that we're going to end up with another pandemic. So I think a lot of us would argue that we need to learn those lessons and we need to institute reform, and we don't need to retreat, and we don't need to destroy what we've built. And so we're kind of at a really interesting moment in time. And I know I'm frustrated. I think everyone's frustrated looking at what's happening right now, because I don't think we're getting a lot of clarity of what exactly is being attempted in terms of changing these regulatory agencies and these government institutions. It feels, and maybe it's just a matter of communication, that it's not clear what exactly the outcome that we're trying to move towards. I know just recently from the NIH side, there was a proposal that was actually communicated from the government that suggested they wanted to move from 27 institutes and centers to 5. Now, I'm not either for or against that. I just need to know more about what that's going to look like and how does that change the mission and the function of the NIH. It would be nice to better understand what that means. But I'm also I don't think the status quo is ever the right thing, because we're working in an environment where things are rapidly changing, where we're making discoveries that are changing the way that we develop and discover new therapies. And we need a regulatory oversight, and we need government institutions that can keep up with those changes. And so I know that we need to create agencies that can be nimble and can change and can adapt to things like AI. I mean, how is artificial intelligence going to change health and wellness? It's changing it before our eyes. And what role does the government play in that? I think that we'd like to understand more clarity on the things that are happening right now and why these reforms are being proposed and what the outcome is going to happen. I think, when you just look at, right now we have one political party in this country that controls the House and the Senate and the presidency. And so a lot of these changes can be pushed through. I find it disturbing that a lot of the stuff seems to be being pushed through just from the executive branch of the government. I think that it would be far better outcome for all of us if we actually had a legislative process that could actually institute changes in these organizations if they're going to happen. If I am to put on, look into a crystal ball and say what happens next, I would hope that these reforms are targeted. They're not just wide sweeping and just say we're cutting across the board, that we look at each individual agency, we look at each individual institute and center, and we try to understand how each one can be changed. Now, do some of them need to be contracted? Maybe that's the right conclusion. But I think that the challenge that we face right today is there's not enough transparency in this process that we can all understand where we're headed. And I think that when you have lack of transparency and lack of clarity, it creates anxiety and it creates chaos. And I think that's I think what most of us are feeling right now in this field is none of us really could tell you what is exactly going to be the outcome of these proposed. And some of them are just rumored, right? I mean, I'm not sure that we actually even know a lot of these changes. We just know there's a lot of jobs being cut from these agencies. And so it seems that that's the first thing that's happening is they're just laying off a bunch of people. And it's not clear. And I don't think we've been clearly told what the outcome of this is going to look like. So I think that it's likely, based off of things that we've heard from people that are actually part of this administration, is they want performance-tied funding. They want to better understand spending money from the government leads to what outcomes. They want to have checks and balances in place for bias. On its face, those things seem fine to me, but it's just how they get implemented, and what that means in terms of continuing to support the leadership of the United States in this area. I think for me, just broad cuts or consolidation is we're going to likely see that happening. That's what we're seeing right now. I think that what the little that's been communicated to us is that we're going to see broad cuts and consolidation of these organizations. And I think that's controversial, but currently in the political climate, it's a viable strategy for them to take. And so at the end of the day, science doesn't happen in a vacuum. It lives in the real world. And unfortunately, politics and money and consequences are part of what the equation that we have to face as scientists. And all of us wish that we had a way just to kind of do our own thing and put our heads down and study what we want to study. But unfortunately, we live in a world where all of these things interact with each other. And when we turn to the government for funding most of our research, when changes happen politically, they can have consequences on what happens with our research funding. So whether the NIH and the FDA emerge stronger or weaker from this moment, I think it's going to define health innovation for a generation. And I am very worried about what the outcome is going to look like. I'm concerned as a person involved in research and involved in trying to develop new therapies. I'm concerned that we're going to emerge from this in a way that we're not going to have the same leadership as we've had in the world. And I would argue that the world may not be better off because of that. And it's going to shape our innovation. And the one thing that I think is very much more fragile than people realize is, we think that in the United States that we are the source of innovation for basically everything, that we look at it and say, all the tech innovation has happened here. The AI innovations happening here. The health related innovations happened here. But I unfortunately believe that all is at risk right now. And we've got to be very careful that we don't cede our leadership as the innovation leaders in the world. I think what that's going to do to our economy and our future and really to our health is frightening. And I hope that we are engaged in this process and we don't just sit back and wait and see what happens, but we let our voices be known that we're worried about what these outcomes are. And at the very least, it'd be great to get more clarity and more communication from the leadership at the NIH and the FDA. It really help in Health and Human Services, which is all the cabinet level governing agency that oversees both the NIH and the FDA. And we could throw the CDC in there as well. They're obviously part of this whole thing. Hopefully we get better clarity on what's happening and why these changes are being made. I think at the end of the day, for me, change is part of life. It's something that we constantly deal with, and I don't, that alone doesn't make me anxious. But I think just having a lack of clarity and a lack of understanding of what we're trying to change and why we're trying to change it, I think we could do a better job at trying to communicate that. So hopefully it gives you some ideas to think about. I've tried to be as down the center as I could and helping you understand both sides of why this has become a hot button issue in our society today. And certainly top of mind for people that work in this field. And hopefully, I've said it many times that I think hope is part of being a researcher in this field. That we tend to be optimistic and hopeful people. I still have hope that we can emerge out of this stronger instead of weaker, and I hope that we define a new generation of health innovation in a very positive way. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that happens. I'm trying to be engaged with political leaders and health policy makers to try to influence as much as I can what I think is good policy, and at the end of the day, what's good medicine. And that's why we have this conversation. So hopefully this has been helpful for you to better understand this. And I would just say, stay curious, stay informed, and stay committed to good science. Good science is good medicine. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of Good Medicine. Thanks for joining us as we explore the science and stories behind health, medicine, and innovation. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a great zero-cost way to support us. In addition, please click, follow, and leave a review for the podcast on Apple and Spotify. If you have questions or comments for me, please put them in the comments section on YouTube or reach out on all social media platforms at Good Medicine. Links are in the description. The best way to support the podcast is to check out the sponsors of the show. You can do this by looking at the links in the show notes. That's it for today. I'm Dr. David Beers, and we'll see you next time.